Did you know that centuries, literally centuries before the European voyages we always hear about, there were already these sophisticated maritime networks, crisscrossing vast oceans, connecting lands, cultures? It's pretty amazing.
Absolutely. It's a history that's far richer and honestly more interconnected than the standard narrative often suggests.
Right. So today, we're going to look at a whole collection of historical accounts, trying to piece together a bigger picture of this early oceanic history. We'll uncover some ancient trade routes, maybe some surprising voyages.
And see how these seemingly separate worlds were in fact quite linked.
Exactly. And before we really set sail, if you enjoy digging into ideas like this, we wanted to mention a YouTube channel called Mindful Moments.
Oh yeah, it's quite interesting. They use AI to analyze books, and it offers these, well, fresh takes. Really makes you think.
It does. A great way to go deeper on topics like the ones we're touching on today. So yeah, check that out.
Okay, so the sources we're looking at today cover a huge span, right? Atlantic, Indian, Pacific Oceans, from way back in prehistoric times up to the early modern period.
It's a lot to cover. Our plan, really, is to pull out the most compelling bits, the moments of real ingenuity, the surprising connections.
And give everyone a clear, but hopefully really engaging overview, highlighting the patterns and the standout moments.
Okay, let's start with the Atlantic, because the usual story starts with, Columbus.
But the history goes so much deeper. We've got evidence of trade, migration in the Caribbean going back millennia before Columbus arrived.
Millennia. And not just there, right? In the Eastern Atlantic, too.
Definitely. Think Neolithic times. You've got connections linking places like Orkney and Shetland, all the way down to France, Iberia, established sea lanes.
So the Atlantic wasn't this big, empty barrier people waited centuries to cross. It was already being used.
Precisely. And later on, you get things like the Hanseatic League, connecting the Baltic trade networks out into the North Sea and the Atlantic. Yeah. It's a long, continuous story of interaction that predates the so-called age of exploration.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift eastward. The Indian Ocean. You hear it compared to the Mediterranean sometimes.
It's a very apt comparison, actually.
Yeah.
Geographically, you have Sri Lanka, kind of like Sicily, southern India, like Italy, natural stepping stones.
Ah, okay.
And these features facilitated connections between the Western and Eastern Indies. And that term Indies, back then, it was broad. It wasn't just India and Indonesia.
It included Africa, too.
Yeah, the east coast of Africa. This vastness sometimes led to historical confusion, even playing into myths like the search for Prester John.
Wow. And the key thing there, I suppose, were the monsoon winds.
Absolutely critical. They created this predictable, reliable highway across the ocean. It meant not just goods, but ideas, religions, technologies could spread incredibly quickly, much faster than overland sometimes.
Makes sense. Let's go even further back. The Persian Gulf. 3rd millennium BC. That's ancient.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it was a major maritime route even then. We have archaeology, we have literary texts, even business documents from Sumer.
Business documents? Like what?
Showing trade connections with the Indus Valley civilization, for instance, and mentioning these, well, somewhat mysterious lands called Dilmun and Malua.
Mysterious how?
Well, their exact locations are still debated by scholars. Dilmun sometimes sounds like Bahrain, Malua, maybe the Indus region, but it shifts. Dilmun even pops up in Sumerian myths as a kind of paradise linked to their flood story.
So these voyages were shaping their worldview, their mythology even?
Exactly. It shows how deeply embedded this seafaring was.
What about the Red Sea? Was it as busy?
It had its moments. Sometimes the historical record goes quiet, but it was definitely important. By the 1st millennium BC, there's a port at Arsinoe near modern Suez. We find South Arabian pottery up in the Gulf of Aqaba.
And later, under the Romans.
Oh, it really thrived then. Ports like Bernice and Myos Hormos became key hubs for trade with India. We found papyri, ostraka bits of pottery, used for notes at Bernice.
Giving details.
Yeah, fascinating details. Lists of goods, like Italian wine being shipped out. And they tell us about the people living there, a real mix of cultures in these port towns.
It paints such a vivid picture. And this Roman trade with India, how far did it reach?
Pretty far. There's a text, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, like a sailor's guide, that talks about the lure of India's riches. Traders sailing from Egypt right across to the Ganges Delta looking for silk, pearls.
The Ganges, wow. And figures like Ptolemy the geographer, he knew about places further east too.
He did. He mentions Patna in India and the Golden Chersonese, which is likely the Malay Peninsula area, a vital point for trade heading towards China.
So awareness was growing.
Definitely. There's even a suggestion that an embassy from Emperor Marcus Aurelius might have reached the South China Sea, probably trying to get direct access to Chinese silk.
Incredible ambition. Did this trade just collapse when Rome declined?
Not entirely.
Yeah.
The network shifted, but they didn't just disappear. Ports like Barbaricon, near modern Karachi, and Barigaza in India seem to have stayed active.
So others picked up the slack.
Exactly. New powers rose in Southeast Asia, like Funan and later Srivijaya, and Persian and Arab traders became much more prominent, forging new connections, especially between India and China. It's a story of adaptation and resilience.
Let's talk about Srivijaya then. Based in Southeast Asia, right?
Yes, centered around Sumatra. They became a major maritime power, controlling the Straits of Malacca and Sindan, crucial choke points.
So they controlled the trade routes between India and China.
To a large extent, yes, they fostered that trade. The South China Sea became this huge hub, maybe comparable to the Mediterranean, but with its own rhythm, its own monsoons, its own dangers.
And we have physical evidence of this.
We do. Shipwrecks are amazing for this. The Belitung shipwreck, for example, from the 9th century, or the Intan wreck.
What did they find?
Incredible cargoes, Chinese ceramics, goods from the Middle East, Southeast Asian items, all on one ship. It's like a snapshot of that interconnected trade. Underwater time capsules, really.
Amazing. Now, shifting back west a bit, you mentioned the Cairo-Genisa.
Yes, an absolutely extraordinary find. It's a collection of documents found in an old synagogue in Cairo. Thousands of fragments.
And they tell us about trade?
They tell us about the lives and businesses of Jewish merchants, mainly between the 10th and 12th centuries. Their letters, accounts, they reveal extensive trading networks.
Covering where?
All through the Mediterranean, naturally, but also deep into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Connecting Egypt with India, Yemen, it shows just how integrated these medieval trade routes were, linking communities across vast distances.
It sounds like personal letters bringing global trade to life.
That's exactly what it feels like.
Okay, let's jump over to East Asia. Korea and Japan often feel a bit separate in Western histories of this time.
They are often overlooked, but they had significant maritime interactions. Korean contact with Japan was intense by the 7th century AD. There were even naval battles.
Really? And later?
Later, the Japanese engaged more in trade and cultural exchange with the mainland. We see embassies going back and forth, like from Silla in Korea to Japan.
And individual journeys.
Yes, the diary of the Japanese monk Ennen, who traveled to China in the 9th century, is incredible. It gives such a vivid picture of the sea travel, the dangers, dealing with officials in different ports. It really underscores that maritime history was happening everywhere, not just a European story.
A good reminder, how did the Mongol invasions affect things at sea?
Significantly. Obviously, their huge attempts to invade Japan by sea are famous.
Yeah.
And famously failed.
Twice, right. Typhoons helped.
The kamikaze, the divine winds, yes. But their control over China did shift trade patterns. Quanzhou, for instance, became a massive international port under the Mongols. So even land empires reshaped the seas.
Then came the Ming Dynasty in China and the famous voyages of Zheng He.
Right, early 15th century. These were state-sponsored expeditions on an unprecedented scale. Huge treasure ships.
Where did they go?
Across the Indian Ocean, they reached India, Sri Lanka, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, East Africa, projecting Chinese power and prestige.
It's staggering. And then they just stopped. Why?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Internal politics, cost, a shift in priorities back towards land borders. Historians still debate it, but it definitely leaves you wondering, what if?
How might history been different?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Back in Southeast Asia, after Srivijaya faded, what happened?
Malacca rose to prominence. Strategically located right on the Strait of Malacca, it became the next great trading hub.
Crossroads again.
Exactly. Interestingly, its foundation myths even try to link it back to Alexander the Great, showing the mix of cultural influences converging there.
Okay, let's swing back all the way to the Atlantic again. We talked about pre-Columbian activity, but what about early European exploration before Columbus became the main story?
Well, there are hints. Way back in the 4th century BC, you have Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer from what's now Marseille.
What did he do?
Accounts suggest he sailed north, possibly reaching Britain, maybe even further exploring the northern Atlantic. It shows that curiosity, that ambition, wasn't unique to the 15th century.
And the North Sea. We mentioned the Hanseatic League later, but earlier.
Oh, plenty of action. From the 1st century AD onwards, you have Germanic groups raiding Roman Britain by sea. Then, famously, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes crossing over to settle Britain.
The beginnings of England really were a maritime movement.
In large part, yes. And then, of course, you get the Vikings.
Right, dominating the North Atlantic.
Absolutely. Raiding, trading, colonizing Iceland, Greenland.
And North America.
And North America. Their ship technology, the long ship, was incredible. And their navigation, finding their way across those vast, often stormy waters.
Using sunstones, maybe? Following birds.
Probably a combination of techniques: star navigation, sun compasses, landscape recognition, maybe knowledge of currents and wildlife. Truly remarkable skill. And sheer guts, frankly.
The sagas tell these stories, right? About Vinland.
They do. The Greenlander saga,
Yeah.
Beric the Red saga, they talk about voyages to places they called Helluland, likely Baffin Island, Markland, Labrador, and Vinland, probably Newfoundland, maybe further south.
Centuries before Columbus.
Centuries. They tried to establish settlements, but it seems to have been difficult conflicts with indigenous people, perhaps, the distance.
Yeah.
But they were definitely there.
Is there archaeological proof?
Yes, the settlement at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland is definitively Norse. And there's evidence of Norse materials found in Inuit sites in the Canadian Arctic, too, suggesting contact.
It's an amazing story, and complex, too, reading about figures like Freydis Eiríksdóttir in the sagas. Not always peaceful encounters.
No, definitely not. Human nature, conflict, and cooperation, it was all there.
Meanwhile, back in Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League we mentioned earlier really took hold.
Yes, became a major power in the Baltic and North Seas from the 13th century onwards. A powerful trading confederation of merchant guilds and towns.
They swear meanly.
Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, Bergen, and Norway were key centers. They controlled the trade in essentials like Baltic grain, timber, fur, wax, and crucially, dried cod from Norway and Iceland.
God, really?
Hugely important. Preserved fish was a vital food source in Catholic Europe, especially during Lent. The Hanseatic League basically monopolized that trade for a long time, linking the resources of the north with the markets further south.
So these weren't just explorers, they were building serious economic power at sea.
Absolutely. They had their own trading posts, enforced their own rules, sometimes even waged war.
What about England during this later medieval period? Were they getting more involved?
They were. Bristol on the west coast became a really important port, especially for the wine trade with Gascony and France. They were definitely developing their own maritime interests.
And there are those intriguing hints. Maybe English voyages reaching Greenland or even further west before Columbus?
There are whispers, yes. Claims about Bristol fishermen finding lands across the Atlantic while searching for fishing grounds. It's hard to prove definitively, but it suggests the possibility of wider exploration than the official records always show.
Always more going on beneath the surface. Which brings us to the Portuguese in the 15th century, a real game changer.
Undeniably. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, though he didn't actually sail much himself, they systematically pushed down the coast of Africa.
What was the goal?
Initially, maybe access to West African gold, bypassing the trans-Saharan trade routes controlled by Muslim states. Also the desire for spices from the east, and perhaps finding the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John to ally against Islam. Eventually, this persistent exploration led them further and further south, around the Cape of Good Hope, and finally into the Indian Ocean. Figures like Diogo Cone really pushed the boundaries.
A pivotal moment, opening that sea route. And then Columbus.
Then Columbus, sailing west for Spain, looking for a route to Asia, and, well, stumbling upon the Americas. A turning point, absolutely, leading to massive European colonization.
But it's crucial to remember, as you said earlier, the Caribbean wasn't empty.
Not at all. It was a dynamic region. The Taínos, the Caribs, they had complex societies, extensive trade networks between islands. Using these incredibly impressive large canoes, they were skilled mariners in their own right.
So Columbus arrived in a place that already had its own maritime world.
Precisely.
And after Columbus, others followed quickly, right? Still looking for Asia.
Yes, John Cabot, sailing for England, for example, also looking for a westward route. Interestingly, Italian financiers like Florentines and Genoese were often backing these voyages, whether for Spain, Portugal, or England.
Spreading the risk, following the potential profit.
Exactly. And it took a while for Europeans to even realize that these lands weren't Asia, but a whole new world. Vast continents blocking the way.
While they were figuring that out, Vasco da Gama actually made it to India, around Africa.
Yes, 1497-98. His successful voyage opened that direct sea route. It bypassed the old overland and Red Sea routes challenged the Venetian and Mamluk control over the spice trade, and led pretty quickly to Portuguese attempts to dominate Indian Ocean trade, often violently.
A huge disruption. Were there other, maybe less famous voyages happening around then?
There were. For instance, there's the voyage of Binot Palmier de Gonville, a Frenchman, around 1503. He was trying to get to India via the Cape of Good Hope, but got blown off course and likely ended up somewhere on the coast of Brazil.
So accidental discoveries, too.
Lots of those. And then the ultimate voyage of that era, Magellan's circumnavigation.
Or rather, the circumnavigation completed by his crew after he was killed.
Right. Magellan himself died in the Philippines in 1521. Juan Sebastian Elcano managed to get one ship, the Victoria, back to Spain in 1522, the first ship to sail around the world.
An incredible feat, but highlighting the immense dangers and the rivalries, too. Wasn't Elcano trying to avoid the Portuguese on the way back?
Absolutely. He had to take a risky route across the Indian Ocean and around Africa, deep in Portuguese territory. It underscores the intense competition.
And this opening of the Atlantic and the colonization of the Americas had a horrific side effect.
The transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
Portuguese bases in West Africa, initially for gold and other goods, became central to capturing and shipping enslaved Africans to work on plantations, especially sugar plantations, in the Americas and the Atlantic islands like Cape Verde.
A truly dark chapter fueled by these new maritime connections.
Undeniably.
While the Portuguese focused on the Indian Ocean route, the Spanish were still looking west, across the Pacific.
They were. Having established themselves in the Americas, they still wanted access to the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, from the east. Figures like Andres de Urdaneta figured out the return voyage across the Pacific, using the trade winds.
Which opened up trade between the Americas and Asia.
Yes, leading to the establishment of Manila in the Philippines as a Spanish hub, connecting Acapulco in Mexico with Asian trade, especially Chinese goods, via the famous Manila galleons. Spain now had a foothold in the Asian maritime world, too.
Meanwhile, the English were trying a different route.
They were looking for a northeast passage around the north of Russia and Siberia to get to Asia. Early attempts, like those of Willoughby and Chancellor in the 1550s, met with disaster, ice.
Didn't work out.
Not by sea. But Chancellor did reach Russia overland, which led to the establishment of the Muscovy Company and opened up trade routes with Russia and eventually Persia that way. So failure at sea led to success on land, in a way.
Interesting. Let's jump forward a bit. The Dutch become a major power in the 17th century, right?
Hugely dominant. They muscled in on the Portuguese in Asia, took control of the spice trade in Indonesia, established Batavia, modern Jakarta as their headquarters.
They were everywhere.
Pretty much. Strong in the Baltic trade, active in the Mediterranean, they even had exclusive trading rights with Japan for a long period through an artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor. And they were exploring, too.
Australia.
Yes. Figures like Willem Jans made the first documented European landing in 1606. Abel Tasman later mapped parts of Tasmania, New Zealand, Fiji. The Dutch had a truly global reach, though not without incident. The Batavia shipwreck story is harrowing.
Right. Mutiny, survival, brutality. A grim tale of early exploration.
It really is.
What about the English in the Americas during this time?
They were establishing successful colonies, particularly in North America, but also in the Caribbean. Barbados became incredibly wealthy based on sugar production, relying heavily on enslaved African labor.
And conflicts with Spain continued.
Oh, yes. England captured Jamaica from Spain in 1655, and it became a major English base, notorious for privateering, essentially state-sanctioned piracy against Spanish shipping.
Always about the trade and the resources.
Fundamentally, yes.
Okay, fast forward again. After the American Revolution, the newly independent United States jumps into global trade.
Pretty quickly, yes. Especially the China trade. By the late 1780s, ships like the Empress of China were sailing from New York direct to Canton, trading things like ginseng for tea and porcelain.
Getting in on the action.
Definitely. And American ships and captains like Captain Robert Gray exploring the Pacific Northwest coast started playing a bigger role, particularly in the Pacific fur trade.
And Russia was expanding across the Pacific, too, from the other direction.
Yes, pushing east across Siberia into the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, primarily driven by the incredibly valuable sea otter fur trade. Imperial ambitions played a part, too.
It's fascinating how all these powers are converging on the Pacific. But it wasn't just Europeans and Americans, right? Indigenous adaptation.
Absolutely. A remarkable example is King Kamehameha of Hawaii. In the late 18th, early 19th century, he saw the European ships arriving and realized their power.
So what did he do?
He acquired European shipbuilding knowledge and materials and built his own fleet of European-style vessels. He used them to unify the Hawaiian Islands and even engage in trade directly with China, trading sandalwood. A brilliant example of indigenous agency and adaptation.
That's incredible. Didn't expect that. Okay, 19th century, things are speeding up. Britain is establishing key ports.
Yes. Think Singapore, founded by Stanford Raffles in 1819, and Hong Kong, acquired after the First Opium War in 1842. Both became hugely important free ports, dominating trade in Southeast Asia and connecting global networks.
And even in places like Morocco, rulers were trying to engage with this global trade.
Right. The Sultan of Morocco founded the port city of Mogador, Essaouira, in the 18th century, specifically to encourage trade with Europe, showing that desire for maritime connection wasn't just a European phenomenon.
Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, and connecting the oceans themselves became a big goal. The Panama Canal dream.
Exactly. The desire to cut across the Isthmus of Panama is old, but in the 19th century, with new technologies, it seemed more possible. The Panama Railway was built first, in the 1850s, dramatically speeding up transit. The canal itself, though, faced huge challenges and wasn't completed until the early 20th century.
But the railway itself was a big deal, and then came steam power.
Revolutionized everything. Steamships weren't dependent on winds, they could keep schedules, travel times plummeted. The whole pace of global connection just accelerated dramatically in the 19th century.
Were there downsides initially? Fuel.
Yeah, early steamships needed huge amounts of coal, limiting their range or requiring coaling stations all over the world, so sailing ships didn't disappear overnight.
Still had a role to play.
Oh yes, even into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you had, for example, Greek ship owners operating large fleets of tramp steamers and sailing ships, picking up cargo wherever they could find it.
And the Åland Islands.
A really fascinating case. These islands between Sweden and Finland maintain a large fleet of big ocean-going sailing ships, windjammers, right into the 1930s and 40s, competing in the global grain trade from Australia. The last hurrah of commercial sail on that scale.
Wow, what a journey through history. It really shows the oceans weren't barriers, but highways for millennia.
Absolutely. From the earliest coastal traders, the Polynesians navigating by stars, the vast Indian Ocean networks, the Vikings, Zhang, right up to the age of steam. It's a story of constant movement, exchange, and human ingenuity.
As you can see, the history of the seas is just so much more complex and, well, interconnected than the simple stories we sometimes get. Ancient mariners, huge trading networks, explorers. The oceans have always been this stage for ambition and connection.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does our view of today's globalized world change if we really take on board these incredibly deep and diverse maritime routes? It didn't just start a few centuries ago.
That's a great point. Well, we hope this exploration has sparked some curiosity for you all. And remember that Mindful Moments channel on YouTube if you want to explore book analyses in a similar reflective way.
And if you enjoyed this discussion, please do subscribe to our show for more explorations of fascinating subjects.
Yeah, subscribe. Maybe share it with someone you think might find it interesting. We'll put links to further reading or resources in the show notes, perhaps even a link to pick up a relevant book if you're keen.
Most importantly, keep thinking critically. Question the standard narratives. Look for those hidden connections that shape our world.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.